It is our pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Samer Janoun, Regional Ethics and Compliance Manager and Head of Compliance Special Oversight at Meta. A certified compliance and ethics professional with extensive experience developing and implementing effective programs, Samer previously held roles at Oracle and Deloitte. He is a passionate advocate for ethics and compliance and a member of the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics as well as the International Compliance Association. According to Samer, ethics and compliance must go beyond just following rules and focus on doing the right thing. This means striving to make the right choices, even when they're harder. Only by doing that do we build trust in the long term.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this session on effective compliance management for international projects. I'm Samer Janoun. I'm a Regional Ethics and Compliance Manager at Meta, and I'm delighted to be here at the ECEC to be able to present on this topic. The title is quite a mouthful, Effective Compliance Management for International Projects. But really what I want to talk about is how can you and your companies engage safely in projects abroad, whether that's a specific project, a construction project, or if it's something like a joint venture or a partnership, maybe something you're engaging in as part of a consortium. I'm going to draw on some insights from personal involvement, personal experience, working on a very exciting project called To Africa, which is a subsea cable we've been working on for the past few years as part of a consortium. We've learned a lot of things. We've implemented some really interesting controls. And so there are some things here I'm going to talk to you about, practical guardrails, governance structures, things that you can do to mitigate your risks. We'll start with identifying the different types of risks you might face. So when you're engaging in a project abroad or you're a new partnership, what kind of risks might you face? And then we'll talk about how you can mitigate them by setting up governance structures, by properly identifying and assessing your risks, by setting up specific tailored controls for the project in question, so on and so forth. And we'll talk about remedial action a little bit as well. So let's get into it. These are just some of the potential risk areas. This isn't designed to be an exhaustive list, and I'm sure you might have other ideas, so please feel free to suggest anything I've missed here in the comments section, but it's just to give you an overall indication of what some possible risk areas might be. For example, corruption. Depending on what market you're planning on entering or where you want to work, corruption might be one of the high priority risk areas for you. If you're going into a jurisdiction that's known to be high on corruption risk, and given all the increased enforcement we've been seeing in Europe, in the US, all over the world really, corruption legislation is some of the most heavily enforced. You know, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the UK Bribery Act, and so on. These are some of the most enforced pieces of legislation. And so corruption risk is definitely one you're going to want to think about, in particular because of the really dire repercussions it can have on companies if we don't really comply in the way we're supposed to. But of course, it isn't the only risk. Depending on the type of project you're doing, for example, with the project I was referring to earlier and that Tanya referenced in the previous session, a subsea cable, one of the major considerations was environmental compliance. How do we comply with environmental regulations? How do we continue to maintain the health and safety regulations and health and safety of people working on the ground, whether it's your own employees, whether it's suppliers' employees? These are really important things to think about, and there's a lot more regulation that you want to comply with when you're thinking about these things. Now, another one that's really interesting and complicated and continues to change and grow is trade compliance and sanctions. We've seen in recent years, given global events, given what's been happening with the world, that trade compliance and sanctions are increasingly complicated. We've seen more complex regimes, and it's been really hard for companies to try and work out how to comply with different sanctions regimes and to keep up with all the changing regulation. So it's another one that's really important to think about carefully when you're assessing your risks. Now, the next three risks I have on here aren't traditional compliance risks. These are things that maybe drive compliance risk for you, but they're important to think about and talk about when you're entering any new project or partnership. Things like geopolitical risk, for example. From recent events, we know that geopolitical issues can strain relationships between nations, between governments, and that can drive compliance risk. For example, strained relationships between major countries, between superpowers, can lead to changes in trade sanctions regimes, which we just talked about. And that could lead to changes in how you're able to source and supply products and materials and key parts of your operation. It could impact your logistical operations and things like that. And so it's very important to think about things that also drive compliance risk indirectly, like geopolitics, like security. Increased security risks mean that you have to worry about the safety of personnel. One, because we want to maintain the safety and security of everyone, but also you want to think about the potential legal exposure and the compliance issues that could result from not properly paying attention to risks like this and having mitigations in place. Also want to talk about commercial and operational risk. This isn't a compliance risk, obviously, not directly at least, but commercial risk can drive compliance risk. If you're entering into a project or partnership that is a really significant investment for your organization, that might put added pressure on people in your organization to behave in ways maybe they otherwise wouldn't. They might feel more pressured to commit a breach or to violate in some way or to act in a way they wouldn't normally do. So it's important as a compliance professional to think about these things and understand what the drivers of potential risk could be. Likewise, for third parties, if a particular investment or project is a really big part of their investment for this year or for the future, then again, it could add increased pressure to act in ways they wouldn't normally do that. So it's important to understand the context of this project and how you're working and all these things that you need to think about when you're going into a new project. Finally, I have anti-money laundering, AML, and CTF here. Again, another really complicated one. Depending on where you're working, there might be dangerous organizations operating in that market. There might be labeled organizations. And going in there, we've seen recent examples in years where companies have gotten in trouble for example, making protection payments, or companies that have faced issues with paying taxes to organizations where, again, they were labeled as dangerous or perhaps designated or sanctioned. So again, something to really think about and a really critical risk to assess when you're going into a new project. Let's talk about how to assess the risks. So I think the work when you're managing for these risks needs to start way ahead of the project. Maybe 1 or 2 years in advance of the project, if you know it's coming down the pipeline or a new partnership, you want to start assessing your risks and mapping them to the different stages of the project. I would start with pinpointing the key stakeholders. Once you identify who your stakeholders are and what their different interests are, you're going to understand what might drive risk from them or for them. Once you've done that, you want to define your project stages. So, typically, let's say with the project I mentioned, there are multiple stages. The project starts with planning and with permitting and licensing. It goes on into construction and then ultimately into operations and maintenance. And you want to map your risks at each stage because they will vary. For example, during permitting and licensing, you might face increased corruption risk because of the engagements with government officials and authorities to obtain licenses and permits. During the construction phase, perhaps environmental, health, and safety risks are heightened. And again, it might vary when you're doing ongoing operations and maintenance. So it's important to map your different risks to your different project stages so you know what to prioritize at different points. Now, once you've done that, you want to then assess the likelihood and impact of each risk. So this is the more traditional risk assessment in the sense that you look at each risk, you identify what the likelihood of that risk is, and what would be the severity of the impact should it materialize. Once you do that, then you can understand what your biggest risks are at each stage, and you can prioritize your mitigation efforts accordingly. Now, once you do that, you've done that successfully, let's assume, and the project kicks off, that your work hasn't ended. You want to continue. You want to continue to monitor and update because you want to check that your assessment matches with reality. If you find that the risks are materializing in different ways, then you might want to fine-tune your risk mitigation and adjust your plans accordingly. And that's why it's very important for your risk mitigation plan to be dynamic, and then you have to update it as you go along. Now, what are some things you can do just at a broad level in terms of governance? I'm going to draw on a couple of interesting things we've done, for example, with this project, and that you could consider in future projects. Of course, these are just examples. This is, again, not exhaustive. But one of the things you could consider, let's say you're working as part of a consortium, as we are. You could consider setting up a compliance committee across the different companies involved in that consortium. So your different compliance departments or representatives will form a committee that can collaborate and essentially help steer the compliance efforts of the project. Now, the way you do that is you want to agree on an operating procedure, on a scope of that committee, and then you can work accordingly and allow you obviously want to operate within the norms of what's acceptable to share, but compliance is one of those things where companies don't really compete. Generally, we're all aligned in that compliance is important. We want to be compliant. We want to be ethical. And so there's a lot of room for collaboration or maybe sharing resources and expertise and giving each other visibility of the work you're working on. Because again, if you're in a partnership structure, you could have liability for each other's legal risks. And so it's important to think about how you can collaborate. And a committee is one way to do that. Another thing you could consider is having compliance audits. So for example, you might decide if a project is high risk enough, or a partnership is high risk, or you're working with high risk counterparties, you might think about setting up compliance audits, making them required, maybe annual compliance audits. And those can take different shapes and forms. For example, you might audit your counterparties to make sure they're complying with the contractual compliance obligations. Or you might have a best practices compliance audit, bringing in an external organization, say like an accounting firm, that can give you an opinion on whether your counterparties, maybe even your own organization, if you're complying with compliance best practices and mitigating your compliance risks appropriately. While we're on the topic of governance, I want to go into this next point about resourcing. It sort of really kind of bridges both topics between governance, but also tone from the top and resourcing. If you have a project or a partnership, maybe a joint venture that's sufficiently high risk, you might want to think about establishing some kind of risk management committee, a cross-functional group of perhaps different leaders from the business that are involved in this project, and then get them to essentially steer the risk profile and the risk appetite on that project. Invariably, during a project, you're going to reach points where you have to make decisions depending on risk-reward calculations. And so having a group that you can go to advise on that is a really, really important resource. And it sends a tone from the top that the company is taking risk management seriously and that people really need to be thinking about how their decisions and activities impact risk. Now, again, depending on the size of your organization, on the size of the project, it may be appropriate to consider whether you need dedicated compliance resources. Say, for example, if you're setting up new legal entities in new markets, or you're entering into joint ventures, you might determine that you need a dedicated compliance resource. So you hire someone, perhaps even temporarily if the risks are only materializing over a specific period of time, maybe having a dedicated compliance or operational resource that can help manage those risks and sort of be your eyes and ears on the ground. Now, if that's not possible, if it's not justified, or if your team isn't big enough to sort of support that, then you might think about leveraging internal stakeholders from other teams to support your compliance mission. For example, one thing we've done that I've thought has been very successful is we've leveraged compliance points of contact in the business by identifying the people that manage higher risk third parties and then training them and seeking their support with compliance messaging. So for example, they'll support on such things as training, on compliance, spotting issues, flagging red flags, and so on. So using these people can really augment your reach and your ability and will allow you to sort of leverage existing resources without the need to go out and hire more people. Now, I want to talk about tailored controls in a little bit of detail because this is something that's been really crucial for us, sort of having tailored controls for the specific project or partnership. These could be financial controls, and they could be at both, say, for example, with this project, because we're part of a consortium, they could be at the consortium level, or they could be at the level of your own organization internally. But the reason these are so important are because, essentially, let's say you have financial controls that allow you to assess the risk of any payment you're making, that could severely mitigate your risk. And so that's just one thing you can think about. It doesn't have to be financial controls. It could be different policies and procedures that you put in place, but they're tailored for this project. For example, you could have tailored training for the project, both internally and externally. You could have in-depth due diligence on your counterparties, which is something I definitely recommend when you're working with new third parties that you're not familiar with or entering new markets. You could inquire about their reputation locally. You could try and assess what their track record is, and if there are any issues of integrity or any red flags you need to worry about. Now, in addition to all of that, another thing is you really, when you're negotiating your contracts, you really want to think about what compliance provisions you want to put into those contracts to allow yourself to have some protection down the road should an issue arise. So, for example, you could go as far as requiring that any third party engaged in this project or partnership has at least the essential elements of a compliance program. So, a code of conduct, an anti-corruption policy, so on and so forth. If you don't want to do that and you don't want to be so broad, you could choose to have specific clauses. For example, things related to whistleblowing specifically or investigations and how much visibility you get into those types of things on this project. If you have a counterparty that you're working with, say, for example, a contractor, and then they're using subcontractors that are going to be doing work on your behalf, you may think about requiring them to conduct due diligence on their own subcontractors. It's one thing for you to conduct your own due diligence on your suppliers, but then if they're having subcontractors doing work for you, then maybe you want to understand what those subcontractors' reputation looks like. You could have training requirements, for example. I hope most organizations these days have some kind of compliance training, but if they don't, you could require that in the contract and say that they have to train their employees, at least the ones working on your project, say, annually on compliance. You could have certification requirements where they're required to get certifications from their subcontractors that they're behaving ethically and legally. And you could have notification obligations. So what I mean by that is you could put it into the contract that if your supplier, contractor, third party becomes aware of a compliance issue, they're required to notify you, say within a certain period of time, 30 days, whatever it is, a set period of time that's appropriate, they have to notify you of an issue. And that removes some of the exposure on your side for issues that you don't have visibility of, because it makes it incumbent on them to inform you should an issue arise. Now, in addition to that, there are some more typical things you might see in a contract in terms of compliance clauses. So things like audit provisions, really, really important. Having that in the contract gives you the access and the flexibility down the road to bring that up should it become an issue. If you become suspicious of a certain matter or something comes up that makes you feel that you need to conduct an audit, then having that in the contract allows you to have the flexibility to exercise your right and demand to audit your supplier or counterparty or any sort of subcontractor you're working with. Now, in addition to that, something really important to think about is books and records. Some countries will have requirements to maintain books and records up to a certain amount of years. Of course, from the perspective of many pieces of legislation, including corruption legislation, you're required to maintain accurate books and records. And so you could think about bringing that into the contract and requiring your third parties to maintain accurate books and records, but also for a certain period of time as required by the law or as required for your project. Now, last but not least, let's say you do all of this, but one control isn't working in the way that you expected or the way you wanted to. You're going to have to conduct some remedial action. And remedial action is really important because doing it correctly demonstrates your commitment to maintaining a robust set of internal controls. And so let's say you conduct an internal audit or perhaps some kind of risk management review. You want to make sure that you're remediating any findings, any internal control weaknesses in a way that's timely and decisive. It's important to show that you took these findings seriously and that you swiftly took action to remediate them. It's also important to do so decisively. You want to make sure that the remedial action you took actually works. And one way to do that is through validation and monitoring. So it's one thing to remediate it, but then you want to make sure that your remediation worked. And so you could have your internal audit or risk management teams, or for example, if you have an external auditor looking at this for you, you could have them come in and check periodically until the remediation action has been completed that it's effective. And even after it's been completed, to ensure and continue to monitor that it continues to work appropriately. So again, remedial action, really important and a very key part of any robust set of internal controls. In terms of content, that's all I had for you today. I want to thank you for listening into the session. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Please put them in the chat. But otherwise, I'd like to thank everyone for their time and the ECEC for having me.